He didn't come here to celebrate, he came to remind her who she used to be. The thought settled quietly as the glass doors opened and Daniel Brooks stepped inside. His tailored suit catching the warm amber lights of the restaurant like he owned the room, like he had never lost anything at all, laughter trailing behind him as guests followed, champagne already in hand, and beside him Sophie Lane held onto his arm, smiling just a little too brightly. The kind of smile meant to be seen, meant to be compared, meant to win, and then his eyes found her, standing just a few feet away in a simple black uniform, hair neatly tied back, posture straight. Emily Carter looked exactly like what he expected her to be, or at least what he wanted everyone else to believe, just another server blending into polished wood tables and the low hum of quiet jazz. And Daniel's lips curved slowly, almost kindly but not quite. "Emily," he said, as if testing the sound of her name after all this time, as if it belonged to a different life, and Sophie followed his gaze, her expression flickering for a fraction of a second before settling into something softer, something dismissive. "Oh, you work here?" she asked, voice light, curious in the way people are when they already think they know the answer, and the table closest to them went silent, the kind of silence that waits for a reaction, waits for discomfort to bloom. But Emily didn't give them that, her fingers resting lightly against the leather-bound menu, her voice steady, almost gentle. "Welcome, do you have a reservation?" As if she had never heard the undertone, as if none of it reached her. And that, more than anything, made Daniel pause just for a second before he leaned closer, lowering his voice enough to sound personal, loud enough for others to hear. "Still here," he said, glancing around the room. "I guess some people never really move on." A quiet ripple of laughter followed, polite, restrained, but sharp enough to land. And Emily nodded once, writing something down, the movement precise, controlled, like she had practiced this moment long before it ever arrived. Because the truth was, she had recognized his name the second the reservation came through earlier that afternoon. Daniel Brooks, party of 20, private dining, celebration, and she could have declined, could have handed it off, could have stayed hidden in the office upstairs where the city skyline stretched for miles through floor-to-ceiling glass. But she didn't. Instead she chose a different dress code tonight, chose to stand here, under these lights, in front of the version of her past that thought it still had power. And as she guided them to their table, her steps were quiet, unhurried, the soft glow reflecting in her eyes, not fragile, not wounded, just waiting, as if this entire evening had already been written, and she was simply allowing it to unfold exactly the way it was meant to. The table filled quickly with the sound of cutlery and low laughter, the kind that carried just enough edge to remind everyone who was hosting the night, and Emily moved between them with quiet precision, pouring water, setting plates, never once rushing, never once hesitating, as if the weight of the room could not reach her, and yet every glance followed her, some curious, some amused, some waiting for her to break, but she did not. She simply existed within the rhythm of the restaurant like she belonged there more than anyone else in the room, and in a way she did, though no one at that table understood it yet, not even Daniel, who leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the back as if he had claimed the space, watching her with that same familiar expression, the one that used to make her doubt herself years ago, the one that used to make her feel smaller without a single harsh word. "You always liked places like this," he said, picking up his glass, letting the light catch the crystal. "Guess you found a way to stay close to it." And Sophie smiled politely, though her eyes flicked toward Emily with something sharper now, something less curious and more measuring, as if she was trying to understand why this woman did not look defeated, why she did not look like someone who had lost everything. And Emily simply nodded once, placing another dish carefully in front of a guest, her voice calm. "The chef recommends this one," she said, and there was no tremor, no hesitation, just quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself, and that, more than anything, unsettled the air around the table, because people expected a reaction, they expected discomfort, they expected something they could interpret, but Emily gave them nothing except composure, and it lingered, stretching between conversations, slipping into the pauses, until even the laughter started to sound thinner, less sure, and Daniel noticed it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, and for a moment his gaze sharpened, studying her more carefully now, as if trying to find the version of her he remembered, the one who would have looked away by now, the one who would have avoided his eyes, but she did not. She met his gaze briefly, not challenging, not warm, simply present, and then moved on, as if he were just another guest in a room full of many, and something about that felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable in a way he could Not immediately name, so he filled the silence the only way he knew how, with confidence, with volume, with stories about new investments, about expansion, about how life had only gone up since everything ended. His voice steady, practiced, the kind of voice that expected agreement, and the table followed, nodding, laughing, affirming, while Sophie leaned into him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, reinforcing the image he wanted to project. And Emily continued her work, unnoticed in the way that truly powerful things often are before they reveal themselves, moving past the bar where the manager stood watching quietly, their eyes meeting for a brief second, a silent exchange that said more than words ever could, and then she looked away, returning to the floor as if nothing had happened, as if this night were just another service, another table, another story passing through, but beneath that calm surface, everything was already in motion, every detail placed exactly where it needed to be, every moment unfolding with quiet intention, and somewhere between the clink of glasses and the soft hum of music, the balance in the room had already begun to shift, even if no one at that table realized it yet. By the time the main course was served, the air had shifted into something quieter, heavier, like a conversation that no longer needed words to carry its meaning, and Emily could feel it in the way the guests looked at her now, no longer just amused or dismissive, but uncertain, as if something about her did not match the story they had already decided was true, and she moved through them with the same calm rhythm, placing each dish with care, her fingers steady against warm porcelain, the soft glow of the overhead lights catching the edge of her expression, revealing nothing she did not choose to show, and Daniel watched her again, longer this time, his smile fading just slightly at the corners, replaced by something more focused, more deliberate, as if he were trying to understand what had changed, because he remembered her differently, remembered a version of Emily who would have filled this silence with nervous energy, who would have tried to explain herself, to justify her place in a room like this. But this Emily did not explain anything, she did not rush, she did not shrink, she simply existed with a quiet confidence that did not ask for permission, and it unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss, so he leaned forward again, resting his elbows lightly on the table, lowering his voice just enough to feel personal. "You know, I always thought you would do something bigger," he said, glancing around the room as if measuring it against some invisible standard. "Not just this." And the pause lingered, deliberate, designed to land exactly where it would hurt the most, and a few guests shifted in their seats, waiting, watching, expecting something to break, but Emily only looked at him for a brief moment, her gaze steady, unguarded, and then she adjusted the placement of a glass beside him, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table, her voice calm, almost thoughtful. "People often misunderstand what bigger looks like," she said, and nothing more. No defense, no explanation, just a statement that settled into the space between them like something finished, something complete, and Daniel leaned back again, a quiet exhale, slipping through his smile as if he had expected resistance and found none, as if the absence of it made his words feel strangely hollow, and Sophie's hand tightened slightly around her fork, her eyes flicking between them, sensing the shift even if she could not fully define it, because there was something in the way Emily carried herself now, something that did not fit the role she had been assigned, and it lingered in every small detail, in the way the other staff glanced at her with subtle respect, in the way the manager remained close but never intervened, watching the table with quiet attention, as if waiting for a cue only they understood, and Emily noticed it too, that quiet awareness, that silent readiness, but she did not acknowledge it, not yet. She simply continued, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her movements seamless, controlled, like each second was part of something larger unfolding beneath the surface. And as dessert menus were placed on the table, the energy had shifted completely, the laughter softer now, the confidence less certain, as if the room itself had begun to question its own assumptions, and Daniel felt it, even if he did not admit it, the subtle loss of control, the way the night was no longer moving entirely on his terms, and for a moment, just a brief moment, he looked at Emily not as someone beneath him, not as someone he had left behind, but as someone he did not fully recognize anymore. And that uncertainty settled quietly in his chest, unfamiliar, unwelcome, while across from him Emily stood composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze moving across the table one last time before she stepped back, giving them space, giving the moment room to breathe, as if she knew exactly what was coming next, and had already decided she would not rush it, because some truths once revealed did not need to be forced, they only needed the right moment to be seen. The dessert plates arrived with delicate precision, each one placed like a final note in a carefully composed evening, and Emily moved with the same quiet control, her presence steady, unshaken, as if the tension in the room no longer belonged to her at all, and, as she stepped back toward the service station, the soft glow of the kitchen lights spilling into the hallway, the past brushed against her again, not as something painful, but as something distant, something already lived and closed, and for a moment, the memory returned in fragments, a smaller space, a quieter kitchen, the scent of fresh herbs and coffee lingering in the early mornings when the restaurant was nothing more than an idea sketched across long conversations and late nights. When she stood beside Daniel not as someone behind him, but as someone building with him, her savings poured into the first lease, her hands shaping menus, her voice negotiating with suppliers who did not take her seriously until they had no choice but to, and she remembered the day the doors first opened, the nervous excitement, the way the light came through the windows just right, the promise of something real beginning, and she remembered how quickly that promise had shifted, how success had grown unevenly between them, how Daniel had started to speak more and listen less, how decisions became declarations, and how her role quietly diminished until it was no longer something discussed, just something assumed. And then came the conversations that were not really conversations at all, the kind where one person has already decided the ending, where words like expansion and opportunity were used to mask something colder, something more final, and she remembered standing in that same space, though it looked different then, holding onto a contract she had once trusted, realizing that her name was no longer where it used to be, that ownership had shifted in ways she had not agreed to, and how Daniel had looked at her, not with anger but with certainty, the kind that does not expect to be challenged. "You will be fine," he had said, as if that was enough, as if leaving was something she would simply accept, and she had, at least on the surface, because some losses do not need to be argued, they need to be understood, and she remembered the quiet of the apartment that night, the way the city lights felt different through the window, the way everything familiar suddenly felt temporary, and yet even then, something inside her had remained steady, not loud, not defiant, just present, a quiet refusal to disappear completely, and that was the part he never noticed, the part no one ever noticed, because it did not demand attention, it simply waited, and over time, that waiting turned into action, small at first, almost invisible shifts in ownership structures, conversations held in private offices, agreements signed without celebration, each step deliberate, each choice made without the need for recognition, and now, standing just beyond the edge of the dining room, watching the reflection of that same space in the glass, she saw it clearly, not as something she had lost, but as something she had rebuilt in a different form on her own terms, and back at the table, Daniel lifted his glass again, his voice carrying across the room as he proposed a toast, confident, assured, speaking about new beginnings and future success, unaware of how much of the past still lived in the very walls around him, unaware that the foundation he once claimed had long since shifted beneath his feet, and as the guests raised their glasses in response, Emily stepped forward once more, her expression unchanged, her presence quiet, as if she were simply completing another task, but there was something else now, something settled, something certain, like the final piece of a plan that no longer needed to be hidden, because the moment it had been waiting for was finally within reach, and all that remained was for it to reveal itself in its own time. The applause from Daniel's toast lingered just a second too long, like a performance that needed reassurance, and as the glasses lowered and conversations resumed, Emily stepped forward again, her presence quiet but undeniable, collecting empty plates with the same steady rhythm, as if nothing about the evening had shifted for her at all, yet beneath that calm surface, everything was aligning exactly as intended, and across the room, near the far corner where the lighting softened into shadow, a man sat alone at a table that had not been part of the original reservation, his posture relaxed, his attention not on the menu in front of him but on the subtle movements unfolding across the dining room, and Emily noticed him the moment she returned from the kitchen earlier, not because he demanded attention, but because he did not, because there was a stillness about him that contrasted with the performative energy of the celebration, and as she approached his table now, the faint sound of polished shoes against hardwood barely audible beneath the music, he looked up, meeting her gaze with a calm recognition. "That felt familiar, not recent but understood. Busy night," he said, his voice even, almost observational, and Emily gave a small nod, placing a glass of water in front of him. "It usually is," she replied, and for a moment nothing more needed to be said, because both of them understood that this night was not ordinary, not for her, not for what was about to unfold, and he glanced briefly toward Daniel's table, where laughter had returned, louder now, as if trying to reclaim control over something that had already begun to slip. "You chose to let this happen," he said quietly, not a question but a statement, and Emily allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that did not reach for approval, only acknowledged truth. "Some things need witnesses," she answered, and he nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear, as if the rest had already been decided long before this evening began. And back at the table, Sophie leaned closer to Daniel, her voice softer, now less certain. "Are you sure she just works here?" she asked, her eyes following Emily's movements more carefully, noticing the way the staff adjusted subtly when she passed, the way the manager remained attentive without interrupting, the way nothing about her felt accidental, and Daniel dismissed it with a small wave of his hand, though his gaze lingered a moment longer than before. "She always knew how to make things look bigger than they were," he said, but the confidence in his voice no longer carried the same weight, because something about this space, about her, did not fit the narrative he had relied on for so long, and that uncertainty began to settle deeper, threading through his thoughts in ways he could not easily ignore. While Emily moved back toward the service station, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the counter where a single folded document rested, placed there earlier in the evening, untouched until now, its presence quiet but significant, and she paused for just a second, her hand hovering over it, feeling the weight of everything it represented, not just a transaction, not just a number written in ink, but years of rebuilding, of choosing patience over reaction, of allowing time to do what anger never could. And then she picked it up, smooth, deliberate, and slipped it into her hand as naturally as if it were just another receipt, another part of her work. And when she stepped back into the dining room, nothing about her expression had changed, nothing about her pace had shifted, but the air around her felt different now, like the final movement of a symphony that had been building quietly in the background, waiting for the moment when every note would finally be heard. And as she approached Daniel's table once more, the soft hum of conversation began to fade again, not because she demanded silence, but because something about her presence made it inevitable. And across the room, the man in the corner watched without interruption, his gaze steady, as if he already knew exactly how this night would end. And Emily stopped beside the table, the folded document resting lightly in her hand, her posture calm, her voice composed, as if she were simply continuing her role. But there was something else beneath it now, something final, something that did not need to be announced, because it would reveal itself in its own time, and all she had to do was let the moment arrive. The moment stretched just slightly longer than it should have, like the air itself was holding its breath, and Emily stood beside the table with that same quiet composure, the folded document resting lightly between her fingers, unnoticed by most but impossible to ignore once seen. And Daniel glanced up at her with a faint impatience, the kind that came from someone used to being served without delay. "Is there something else?" he asked. His tone, polite on the surface but edged with expectation, and Emily met his gaze for a brief second, not challenging, not soft, simply steady, before she placed the document gently on the table beside his glass, aligning it with the same precision she had shown all evening. And for a moment no one reached for it, no one questioned it, because it did not yet demand attention. It simply existed, quiet, waiting, and she stepped back just half a pace, creating space not for herself, but for the moment to unfold. And Sophie was the first to notice, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at the paper, then back at Emily, sensing something that did not fit, something that did not belong to a typical service interaction. "What is this?" she asked, her voice light but carrying a thread of unease, and Emily did not answer immediately. She only gave a small nod toward the document, an invitation rather than a declaration, and Daniel reached for it with casual confidence, the same confidence that had carried him through every assumption he had made about this night, unfolding it without urgency, as if expecting nothing more than a receipt or a menu note. But as his eyes moved across the page, something shifted, subtle at first, a pause, a slight tightening at the corners of his expression, and then silence settled over him in a way that felt different from before, heavier, more focused, and the table began to notice, conversations fading not because they were interrupted, but because attention had been drawn to something they could not yet see. And Sophie leaned closer, trying to read his reaction before understanding the words herself. "Daniel?" she said quietly, but he did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the document as if it required more than a glance, as if it carried weight he had not expected, and across the room, the manager took a step forward, not rushed, not dramatic, simply present, their voice calm, measured. If there are any questions, I would be happy to clarify, they said, addressing the table with professional ease, but their eyes moved briefly toward Emily, a silent acknowledgement of timing, of alignment, and Daniel finally looked up, his expression no longer certain, no longer controlled in the way it had been all evening. What is this supposed to mean? He asked, his voice lower now, not loud enough to command the room, but enough to carry tension, and the manager stepped closer, hands lightly folded, posture composed. It is a confirmation, they replied, of the ownership transition completed this morning, and the words settled into the space with quiet precision, not raised, not emphasized, just stated, and Sophie's gaze snapped back to the paper, her eyes scanning it more urgently now, searching for context, for explanation, for something that would make sense of what she was beginning to realize, and Daniel's grip tightened slightly at the edge of the page, not enough to crease it, but enough to reveal the shift beneath his calm, because the room he had walked into believing he understood no longer fit the version of reality in front of him, and Emily stood there, unchanged, her expression as composed as it had been from the very beginning, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply allowing the truth to settle in its own time, because this was never about proving something, it was about revealing what had already become true, and across the room, the man in the corner watched with the same steady calm, his presence quiet but grounded, as if this moment was not a surprise but a conclusion, and as the silence deepened around the table, stretching into something undeniable, the balance that had once belonged to Daniel shifted completely, not with force, not with confrontation, but with a single quiet realization that could no longer be ignored, and Emily remained still within it, not claiming the moment, not announcing it because she did not need to, it had already arrived. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like something fragile being set down too carefully, and Daniel's eyes moved across the document again, as if repetition might change what it said, as if certainty could be rebuilt through denial. But the words remained exactly where they were, clear, final, and Sophie's hand hovered just above the table before she pulled it back, her composure tightening into something controlled, something practiced. This has to be some kind of mistake, she said, her voice softer now, no longer meant for the room, but it still carried because no one else was speaking, and the manager remained where they were, calm, unhurried. There is no mistake, they replied, their tone steady, almost neutral, as if they had delivered information like this many times before. And yet their presence held a quiet respect that was not directed at Daniel, but somewhere else entirely, and Daniel finally looked up again, his gaze shifting from the manager to Emily, searching, measuring, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the version of reality he had carried into this room. You knew about this, he said, not quite a question, not quite an accusation, but something in between, something that revealed more uncertainty than control, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation. Her expression unchanged, her voice even. I signed the final approval this morning, she said, and the words did not rise, did not press, they simply existed, undeniable, and the table absorbed them in silence, each person recalibrating their understanding of what they had witnessed all evening, of who she was, of what this place truly represented, and Sophie's eyes widened just slightly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the shift beneath her composure. You own this place? She asked. The question incomplete even as she spoke it, because the document in front of them already answered it, and Emily gave a small, almost thoughtful pause before responding, not to create tension, but because the answer did not need urgency. I built it, she said, and then after a quiet beat, and today I chose to let it go. And that was when the weight of the moment changed completely, not just ownership but choice, not something taken from her, but something she decided to release, and across the room, the man in the corner rose from his seat, his movement subtle, but drawing attention in the stillness, and he walked toward the table with the same calm presence he had held all evening, stopping just beside Emily, not too close, not distant, simply aligned, and Daniel's gaze shifted to him, recognition flickering uncertainly, as if searching through memory for a connection he had not expected to find here, and the man offered a small nod, acknowledging the table with quiet courtesy before speaking. His voice composed, measured. Alexander Hayes, he said, not as an introduction seeking approval, but as a statement of fact, and the name settled heavily, not loud, but significant enough that a few guests exchanged glances, understanding arriving in fragments, and he turned slightly toward Emily, his expression respectful, grounded. "The agreement is finalized," he added, and then his gaze returned briefly to Daniel, not confrontational, not dismissive, simply present, as if confirming something that no longer required explanation, and Daniel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the confidence that had filled the room earlier now replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, because the narrative he had relied on no longer held, and the room itself reflected it. The energy no longer centered around him but redistributed, realigned in a way that did not need to announce itself, and Emily remained where she was, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence steady, not stepping forward to claim anything, not stepping back to avoid it, simply allowing the truth to exist as it was, because this was never about proving him wrong, it was about showing him what had become true without his awareness. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, the distance between who he thought she was and who she had become finally revealed itself completely, leaving nothing left to question, only something to understand. No one spoke for a moment after the name settled into the room, not because they were waiting for permission, but because something about it demanded stillness, and Daniel's gaze lingered on Alexander longer than it should have, searching for control in a situation that no longer offered it. "Hayes?" he repeated quietly, as if the recognition arrived too late to be useful, and across the table a guest shifted in their seat, the realization spreading in fragments, in whispers that did not quite form words yet but carried enough weight to change everything. And Sophie straightened slightly, her composure returning in small deliberate pieces. "So this is some kind of business deal," she said, her tone measured, attempting to reframe the moment into something familiar, something manageable, but Alexander did not rush to respond. He simply glanced at Emily, a brief acknowledgement that centered her without drawing attention before speaking. "It was," he said, his voice calm, "until she decided the terms, and the distinction settled quietly but firmly, not aggressive, not loud, just precise." And Emily remained still, her presence unchanged, her eyes moving across the table not with judgment, not with triumph but with clarity, as if she were seeing everything exactly as it was, without the need to alter it. And Daniel let out a small breath, the kind that tried to steady something internal. "You sold it," he said, looking back at her now, his tone shifting, less certain, more searching, and Emily gave a slight nod, not dramatic, not emphasized. "Yes," she replied, and then after a brief pause, "at a value that reflects what it has become." And there was no pride in her voice, no need to prove anything, only truth, and that made it heavier, because it left no space for dismissal. And Sophie's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her gaze flicking once more between Emily and Alexander, piecing together a narrative she had not anticipated. "How much?" she asked before she could stop herself, the question slipping out not from curiosity, but from the need to measure, to understand the scale of what they were witnessing. And Alexander answered without hesitation, not to impress, but because the number no longer belonged to secrecy. $12 million, he said, and the room absorbed it in silence, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet recalibration of everything they thought they knew. And Daniel's expression changed in a way that could not be hidden now, not shock, not anger, but something deeper, something closer to realization, because the distance between his assumptions and her reality had never been wider. And for a moment he looked at her without the filters he had always relied on, seeing not the version he had left behind, but the one who had continued forward without him, who had built something he no longer recognized, and who now stood in front of him not asking for acknowledgement, not seeking validation, but simply existing beyond his reach. And Emily did not move to fill the silence, she did not step closer, she did not soften the moment, she allowed it to remain exactly as it was, because some truths did not need explanation, they needed space. And across the table, the energy had shifted completely, no longer centered around performance or control, but around understanding, quiet and undeniable. And Alexander stepped back just slightly, not withdrawing, but giving the moment back to her, as if recognizing that this was never about the deal, never about the number, but about what it represented. And Emily reached up calmly, her fingers moving to the small name tag pinned neatly against her uniform, the same one she had worn all evening, the same one that had allowed them to see her as something smaller, something contained, and she unpinned it with a steady motion, placing it gently on the table beside the folded document. the sound almost inaudible, but final in a way that carried more weight than anything spoken, and she looked at Daniel one last time, not with resentment, not with victory, but with a quiet clarity that did not need to be defended, and in that gaze was everything he had failed to see, everything he had underestimated, everything he could no longer undo. And then she turned slightly, her posture unchanged, her steps calm, as if the evening had already ended for her, even though the room was still catching up, still trying to understand the moment that had just passed, because what had shifted could not be reversed, and what had been revealed could not be unseen. The sound of her footsteps faded softly against the polished floor, steady and unhurried, as if nothing behind her held the power to call her back, and for a moment no one at the table moved. No one reached for their glass, no one spoke, because the weight of what had just happened settled deeper than any reaction could immediately reach. And Daniel remained seated, the document still open in front of him, the edges perfectly aligned as she had left them, yet everything about it now felt different, heavier, as if it carried more than ink and paper, as if it held the quiet record of everything he had misunderstood. And his gaze lingered on the name at the bottom, Emily Carter, written with a certainty that did not need explanation. And for the first time that evening, he did not look around for confirmation. He did not search the room for reassurance because there was none to be found, only the undeniable presence of what she had become without him. And Sophie shifted beside him, her posture still composed, but no longer anchored in the same confidence, her voice lower now, careful. "Daniel," she began but did not finish because there was nothing left to say that could reshape the moment, nothing that could return them to the version of the night they had expected. And across the table, the guests avoided direct eye contact, their earlier laughter replaced by something quieter, something reflective, as if they too were recalibrating their understanding of success, of power, of what it meant to truly move on. And near the entrance, Emily paused briefly, not to look back, not to check the reaction she had left behind, but to adjust the sleeve of her uniform, a small, deliberate gesture that carried a finality of its own, and the manager stepped toward her with a subtle nod, their voice low, respectful. "Everything is complete," they said, and Emily returned the nod, her expression calm, unchanged, because there was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to prove. The night had already done what it needed to do. And just a few steps away, Alexander stood waiting, not intruding, not leading, simply present, his posture relaxed, his attention steady, and when she reached him, there was no dramatic exchange, no words that needed to be spoken for others to hear. Only a quiet understanding that passed between them, the kind that came from decisions made with clarity rather than impulse. And together they turned toward the exit, their pace unhurried, their presence aligned without effort, and as the door opened, the cool night air met the warmth of the restaurant, creating a brief moment of contrast, of transition, and Emily stepped through it without hesitation, leaving behind the space that had once defined her, not as someone who lost it, but as someone who chose when to let it go. And inside, Daniel finally leaned back in his chair, the confidence that had filled him earlier now replaced by something far more difficult to ignore. Not regret exactly, not even disbelief, but recognition, the quiet understanding that the narrative he had relied on no longer existed, that the woman he thought he had left behind had not only moved forward, but had done so in a way that no longer involved him at all. And he looked once more at the empty space where she had stood, not searching for her, but acknowledging the absence she had chosen. And in that absence was the clearest truth of all, because she had not returned to prove him wrong. She had not stayed to reclaim anything from him, she had simply lived beyond him. And as the lights of the restaurant continued to glow, unchanged for everyone else, the meaning of that place had shifted completely for him. No longer a stage he controlled, but a reminder of something he no longer understood. And outside, Emily walked into the quiet city night, the sound of distant traffic blending with the soft rhythm of her steps, her gaze forward, her posture steady, not carrying the past with her, not looking back at what she had left behind, because she did not need to. And in that quiet departure, without a raised voice, without a single word of accusation, the story reached its final truth, not in what she said, but in what she chose. And in the silence she left behind, it became undeniable. She did not win him back, she won herself.